Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us again. I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Vicki Goodman, joining us to talk about the recent Phase 3 Keynote 204 positive EU CHMP opinion for expanded approval of KEYTRUDA. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Dr. Vicki Goodman.
Thank you, Neil. It's great to be here.
Give us a bit of your professional background and briefly talk about your role there at Merck.
Sure, happy to. So, I'm a hematologist with now over 15 years of experience in drug development, spanning a stint at the U.S. FDA as well as 3 different pharmaceutical companies. I have been involved in the development of several drugs which are now marketed. And most recently, I joined Merck back in June, and I'm now Therapeutic Area Head for Late Stage Oncology, leading the development of several different molecules, including KEYTRUDA, across a range of different tumor types, including hematologic malignancies.
Now, I understand that this Phase 3 keynote that we're going to be talking about today has to do with the treatment of Hodgkin's lymphoma. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the most common type of Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is called classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, and is responsible for over 90% of all Hodgkin's lymphomas. To tell you a little bit about the disease, this is a relatively uncommon type of cancer with a bimodal age distribution. So you see a peak of cases of classic Hodgkin's lymphoma in patients in their late teens and 20s, and then again in older adults older than the age of 55.
What's the current landscape as far as treatment is concerned?
Yeah, so the good news is Hodgkin's lymphoma tends to be a highly chemotherapy responsive tumor, and many patients can be cured. So after receiving intensive multi-agent chemotherapy, patients who go into a complete response actually have quite a good prognosis. However, there are a subset of patients who relapse following therapy, and patients who either don't respond initially to therapy or who relapse after multiple different lines of therapy, including stem cell transplant, really have a poor prognosis and few treatment options. And so there really is a need for new treatment options. So KEYTRUDA is a drug which activates the immune system by targeting an immune checkpoint called PD-1. And it was first approved in Europe in 2017 for patients with relapsed refractory classic Hodgkin's lymphoma who had progressed following treatment with a commonly used drug called brentuximab vedotin, and had either received a stem cell transplant or were transplant ineligible and progressed. And the activity that we saw there actually was rather striking in that heavily treated patient population. And so what we did was design a Phase 3 study, Keynote 204, which compared KEYTRUDA directly with brentuximab vedotin in relapsed refractory Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it was that study that's the basis for the recent CHMP positive opinion in late January.
Did this study include adults and children as well?
So this study was focused on adults, and there was a separate study that we looked at pediatric patients with a variety of tumors. This was called Keynote 051, including pediatric patients with classic Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so, yes, you're correct. The positive opinion also included pediatric patients older than the age of 3 on the basis of that study as well. So perhaps I can tell you a little bit more about the data from Keynote 204.
Yes.
Which led to the EU positive opinion. Right. So again, this was a study comparing KEYTRUDA monotherapy with brentuximab vedotin. And what we saw was that in the primary endpoint of the study was progression-free survival. And we saw that KEYTRUDA reduced the risk of disease progression or death, improving progression-free survival by 35%. The hazard ratio was 0.65, and the median time to progression or death increased by nearly 5 months from about 8.3 months to 13.2 months. Again, these are patients for whom disease has progressed following multiple lines of chemotherapy and stem cell transplant. So these are really encouraging data, which were presented at the American Society for Clinical Oncology meeting in 2020. And if approved by the European Commission, this would be an extension of the adult indication in classic Hodgkin's lymphoma in Europe to an earlier line of therapy, but again, in relapsed refractory patients. And as mentioned, the CHMP opinion also included a recommendation for the first time for pediatric patients with classic Hodgkin's lymphoma in children aged 3 and older on the basis of that separate pediatric trial.
What areas of hematology research would you say that you're most excited about right now?
So there's been substantial progress in the treatment of many hematologic malignancies, but there are still patients who lack effective treatment options, and so there are a need for new treatments. I would say that particularly exciting now are drugs which directly target molecular drivers of the malignancy, and drugs which can deliver potent chemotherapies directly and preferentially to the tumor cells. This latter group includes drugs called antibody-drug conjugates, which link potent cytotoxic chemotherapies to an antibody which targets antigens on the surface of malignant cells. And Merck has acquired 2 experimental agents which have potential in hematologic malignancies, an example of each, actually. And the first, which we acquired from a company called Arcule, is now called MK-1026. And it's an inhibitor of the tyrosine kinase BTK. BTK inhibitors have already shown efficacy in B-cell malignancies such as chronic lymphocytic leukemia or CLL. And MK-1026 is specifically designed to overcome a mutation which in BTK, which leads to resistance to existing BTK inhibitors. And MK-1026 is now entering a phase 2 study in B-cell malignancies, including refractory chronic lymphocytic leukemia and B-cell lymphoma. We also acquired an antibody that targets potent chemotherapies directly to cancer cells, hopefully sparing normal tissues. This is now called MK-2140, and it targets cells which express ROR1 on their surface. ROR1 is actually a really interesting target because it's expressed during embryogenesis and fetal development, but not really in adult tissues, with the exception of cancer cells. And it actually is expressed in a number of different malignancies. In an early study of MK-2140 in heavily pretreated patients with hematologic malignancies, it showed promising activity in 2 types of lymphoma called mantle cell lymphoma and diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And those data were presented in ASH in December. So we're looking forward to continuing to explore the potential of both of these agents in additional clinical trials and hopefully bringing new treatment options to patients who need them.
Where can our listeners go and get more information about these studies and about KEYTRUDA? KEYTRUDAHCP.com is a great place for information for healthcare providers on KEYTRUDA. Well, I appreciate you joining us, Dr. Goodman, hoping that you'll return.
Thanks so much, Neil.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Dr. Vicki Goodman. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download it, SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/healthprofessionalradio.